A certified appraiser is in a quandary. If the person completes the value analysis in compliance with the waiver of appraisal provision in federal and state regulations and with ODOT procedure, this person could find themselves subject to discipline by the state real estate appraisal board for noncompliance to USPAP. So how can a certified appraiser avoid this quandary? First option, the appraiser can do what is ever necessary to make the value analysis report a USPAP compliance report. This is not a good option, and these are the reasons why. One, the appraiser could add more to the value analysis report than what is required, and that may make it non-compliant with ODOT procedures. By making the value analysis report USPAP compliant, the appraiser has probably turned the value analysis into an appraisal report. If the value analysis is now an appraisal, the waiver of appraisal provision no longer applies. The certified appraiser must now comply with the appraisal provisions and regulations and ODOT procedure and not the waiver of appraisal provision. This will require owner accompaniment when the appraiser inspects the property. It will require an acceptable appraisal format for ODOT. If it's an appraisal, it's going to need to comply with USPAP, and appraisals require appraisal reviews with a recommendation by the review appraiser that the appraisal should be the basis of the offer. And ODOT is not going to pay for all of this when the scope of work only needed a waiver provision value analysis report. There is a better option. The certified appraiser should invoke jurisdictional exception rule in USPAP. And what I've done here is I've reprinted USPAP. So it's from the 2018-19 edition, jurisdictional exception rule. If any applicable law or regulation precludes compliance with any part of USPAP, only that part of USPAP becomes void for that assignment. When compliance with USPAP is required by federal law or regulation, no part of USPAP can be voided by a law or regulation of the state or local jurisdiction. In an assignment involving a jurisdictional exception, the appraiser must, 1, identify the law or regulation that precludes compliance with USPAP, 2, comply with that law or regulation, 3, clearly and conspicuously disclose in the report the part of USPAP that's voided by law or regulation, and 4, cite in the report the law or regulation requiring the exception to USPAP compliance. The jurisdictional exception rule provides a saving or severability clause intended to preserve the balance of USPAP if compliance with one or more parts is precluded by the law or regulation of a jurisdiction. When an appraiser properly follows this rule in disregarding a part of USPAP, there is no violation of USPAP. The law includes constitutions, legislative and court-made law, and administrative rules and ordinances. Regulations include rules or orders having legal force issued by an administrative agency. Instructions from a client or attorney do not establish jurisdictional exception. So summarizing the jurisdictional exception rule, any certified appraiser must comply with USPAP when completing appraisal activities unless a law or regulation precludes the appraiser from USPAP compliance. If the appraiser invokes the jurisdictional exception rule from USPAP, he or she must do the following. They need to identify the law or regulation that precludes compliance with USPAP. They need to comply with that law or regulation. They need to clearly and conspicuously disclose in the report the parts of USPAP that's voided by law or regulation. And 4, they need to cite in the report the law or regulation requiring this exception to USPAP compliance. So, is there a law or regulation in Ohio that precludes certified appraisers from compliance to USPAP? And the answer is yes. And that is from the Ohio Administrative Code, section 5501 2-506, entitled Real Property Acquisition. It's rule B3, called the appraisal waiver thereof, and we're going to review that right now. So there's rule B3. And it says, before the initiation of negotiations, the real property to be acquired shall be appraised except as provided in B3B of this rule, and the owner or the owner's designated representative shall be given the opportunity to accompany the appraiser during the appraiser's inspections of the property. All right, so what that talks about is if an appraisal is done, the agency has to allow the owner to accompany the appraiser on their inspection of the property unless it's subject to paragraph B3B. And here's B3B. An appraisal is not required if, 1, the owner is donating the property and releases the agency from its obligation to appraise the property, or 2, the agency determines that an appraisal is unnecessary because the valuation problem is uncomplicated and the anticipated value of the proposed acquisition is estimated at $10,000 or less based on a review of available data. This is the basis for our waiver valuation. 2 things have to happen based on this code: is the valuation problem has to be uncomplicated and the compensation has to be $10,000 or less. ODOT complies with this regulation by using the appraisal scoping checklist to ascertain complexity and the potential compensation threshold of $10,000. When an appraisal is determined to be unnecessary, the agency shall prepare a waiver valuation. Persons preparing or reviewing a waiver valuation are precluded from complying with standards rules 1, 2, 3, and 4 of USPAP. This is the regulation that precludes the appraiser from complying with certain parts of USPAP. The appraiser is only precluded from complying with standards rules 1, 2, 3, and 4. The person performing the waiver valuation must have sufficient understanding of the local real estate market to be qualified to make a waiver valuation. All right, so this is the table of contents from USPAP. The appraiser is not precluded from these requirements. The appraiser must comply with these parts of USPAP, and those are outlined in black, which is the foreword, the table of contents, the preamble, the definitions, the ethics rule, the record-keeping rule, the competency rule, the scope of work rule, and the jurisdictional exception rule. The appraiser must comply with those parts of USPAP. The appraiser is precluded from complying with these parts of USPAP. Those are standards rules 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we're precluded from complying with that because there is Ohio regulation that precludes compliance to standards rule 1, which is real property appraisal development, standards rule 2, which is real property appraisal reporting, standards rule 3, which is appraisal review and development, and standards rule 4, which is appraisal review reporting. Now, the appraiser is not precluded from these requirements, which is mass appraisal development, mass appraisal reporting, personal property appraisal development and reporting, business appraisal development and reporting. Even though the appraiser is not precluded from complying with these requirements, rarely do we deal with these when we're doing a value analysis report. So these standards really don't apply to the VA, and we're not precluded from those requirements. And statements on appraisal standards, we're not precluded from those requirements. But currently, there are no statements in this version of USPAP. So let's review a few points from USPAP. Here's the preamble, We are not precluded from complying with the preamble, and so an appraiser must comply with USPAP when either the service of an appraiser is required by law, regulation, or agreement with the client or intended user. And that comes right out of, comes out of Chapter 4763.13, which requires USPAP compliance. An appraiser must comply with the ethics rule in all aspects of appraisal practice. An appraiser must maintain the data, information, and analysis necessary to support his or her opinions for appraisal and appraisal review assignments in accordance with the records keeping rule. The appraiser must comply with the competency rule and the jurisdictional exception rule for all assignments. When an appraiser provides an opinion of value in an assignment, the appraiser must also comply with the scope of work rule and the record keeping rule, the applicable developing and reporting standards, and applicable statements. However, there are no statements currently in USPAP. So appraisers are not precluded from complying with the ethics rule, and here is that ethics rule, and we're just going to hit some high points. An appraiser must comply with USPAP when obligated by law or regulation or by agreement with the client or intended users. In addition to these requirements, an individual should comply anytime that individual represents that he or she is performing in service as an appraiser. The ethics rule, the conduct provision, must not willfully or knowingly violate the requirements of the record keeping rule. If known prior to accepting an assignment and or if discovered at any time during the assignment, an appraiser must disclose to the client and in each subsequent report certification, and USPAP does require a certification, any current or prospective interest in the subject property or parties involved, and any services regarding the subject property performed by the appraiser within the 3 years immediately preceding acceptance of the assignment as an appraiser or in any other capacity. Ethics rule, the management provision. An appraiser must affix or authorize the use of his or her signature to certify recognition and acceptance of his or her USPAP responsibilities in the appraisal report or appraisal review assignment. Those come from Appraisal Standards Rules 2.3, 4.3, 6.3, and 8.3, and 10.3. The appraiser may authorize the use of his or her signatures only on an assignment by assignment basis. This is unacceptable for ODOT. We will only utilize the people we hired for the appraisal assignment. And here is the Standards Rule 2-3, which is the USPAP appraisal certification. Ethics rule, the confidentiality provision. There is that rule. We're not precluded from complying with the record keeping rule when doing a value analysis report. Here is that record keeping rule. These are the USPAP rules for maintaining a work file. We're not precluded from complying with the competency rule. These are the USPAP rules for an appraiser to be competent. And we're not precluded from complying with the scope of work rule. And for each appraisal and appraisal review assignment, the appraiser must disclose the scope of work in the report. And the disclosure obligations are: the report must contain sufficient information to allow intended users to understand the scope of work performed. Sufficient information includes disclosure of research and analysis performed, and might also include disclosure of research and analysis not performed. All right, the next 2 slides are going to provide an example of how a certified appraiser may comply with USPAP when invoking the jurisdictional exception provision when preparing a value analysis report for ODOT. And here's a sample of such a thing. We've outlined part of it in a square here, and it says, for this assignment, I have prepared a value analysis report that's been completed in compliance with the procedures of the Ohio Department of Transportation and with the waiver of appraisal provision in the Administrative Code, Section 5501 2-506, Rule B3. As a certified appraiser, I'm required to comply with USPAP unless precluded by law or regulation, and I disclose to the reader and any user of this report that 1, the value analysis report complies with all parts of the 2018 through 19 edition of USPAP except standards rules 1, 2, 3, and 4. All right, so what this is showing is that we're going to be invoking jurisdictional exception. So if we look at item number 2, for standards rules 1, 2, 3, and 4, I invoke the jurisdictional exception rule on page 14 of the 2018-19 edition of USPAP because ODOT Administrative Code, section 5501 2-506, rule B3B2A precludes an appraiser from complying with these USPAP standards when an appraisal waiver valuation is prepared. The value analysis report is the waiver of appraisal valuation used by ODOT. So we've identified the law or regulation that precludes compliance to USPAP. There it is in red, underlined. We've complied with that law or regulation, and we're going to clearly and conspicuously disclose in the report the part of USPAP that's voided by the law or regulation, and that's outlined there in blue, standard rules 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we're going to cite in the report the law or regulation complying this exception to USPAP compliance, and we've already underlined those. All right, the next outline in red is the certification that is developed to show compliance with USPAP. This part inputs USPAP Standards Rule 2-3 requires by the ethics rule of USPAP. We're going to continue on to the next slide, which is more with the certification. The appraiser needs to comply with the scope of work rule and the records keeping rule in addition to this because the appraiser is providing an opinion of value. All right, we're getting towards the end of the course. We want to acknowledge, 1, that ODOT does not require an appraiser to comply with USPAP when preparing the value analysis report because it's a waiver of appraisal. ODOT does not determine who complies with USPAP and who does not. That job belongs to the appraisal board, which part of the Division of Real Estate, Ohio Department of Commerce. The PowerPoint slides in this module are not a guarantee that if an appraiser follows the examples provided that he or she will comply with USPAP. The purpose of this module is to advise the appraiser that he or she may have more required of them than simply following ODOT procedure. It is the appraiser's responsibility to determine when, if, and how he or she should meet USPAP standards. And 6, right-of-way plans used in this module are factual. However, the example built around these plans is not factual and were developed to provide guidance about the value analysis report. All right, it is time for a knowledge check.